German royalties were terrible snobs even for royalties. Exclusivity was like their shared religion, and I blame it on the way that they were raised. The First German Reich, or the Holy Roman Empire as everyone else called it, arrested the development of the monarchies and potential monarchies that it ruled by stopping them from their natural progression of killing each other. Generally speaking, monarchies fought or took over every regional power within reach until they hit one they couldn't because it had really defensible territory or similar power or whatever, and boom, they'd lost a crop of commoners, but they got their first border and their first rival king, and everyone knew where they stood. But under the Holy Roman Empire, no one was allowed to fight inside the borders. They were too busy taking your men to fight everyone else. All the Germanys just had to semi-politely coexist from the 16th to the 19th centuries, cheek by jowl, rubbing shoulders, counting the differences, finding new and annoying ways to compete. The land was rich and productive, and there were nearly 300 German territories, from micro-states to chunky kingdoms, all just leaving each other on the map. Monarchies were supposed to stand largely alone, not need their own damn caste system. And the Holy Roman Empire exacerbated this tendency because for them, smaller was always better. It made you less likely to rebel. So the empire never minded at all if you wanted to split up your territory so all your sons could be princes of increasingly smaller lands. And that was what happened to original Big Boundaries Hesse. Landgraf Philip I split Hesse into 4 territories for his 4 sons in 1567. Hesse Castle, being the biggest, went to the oldest, and Hesse Darmstadt, being the smallest, went to the youngest son. Hesse Darmstadt is the territory and royal family that the paternal line of the Mountbattens came from. In the following 250 years, the middle 2 Hesses died out, to the benefit of both Hessian survivors. But Hesse Darmstadt was still a lot smaller, a lot less well known, run by the junior branch of the family, largely surrounded by Hesse Castle, and a lot less politically important than its big brother. However you measured it, Darmstadt was the lesser Hesse. Then, in the 1790s, Napoleon started hammering the Holy Roman Empire, and by 1805 the new Emperor of France was the guy in charge of at least a third of Germany, and he was arranging that into a pleasing confederation. Meanwhile, the Holy Roman Empire fell back to its backup empire, the Austrian Empire, surrendering Germany and leaving Prussia to lead the fight against France's Grand Armée. And by 1812, Prussia and a couple of states close to Prussia were the only holdouts left. In these tumultuous times, Hesse-Darmstadt was blessed with a wily ruler called Ludwig, who moved smartly over to Napoleon's side and made himself a can-do member of the Confederation. Hesse Castle was much less fortunate. It was just too tasty a morsel for Napoleon, so it got bundled up with some other territory in West Germany to make a kingdom for Napoleon's brother, the short-lived Kingdom of Westphalia. Throughout the Napoleonic period, Hesse-Darmstadt and Ludwig did very well, bulking up on territory from less fortunate neighbours, and Ludwig got a promotion. He had started as Ludwig X Landgraf, but Napoleon promoted him to become Ludwig I Grand Duke. Back in the day, titles were actually important, and not just as a way of keeping social score. They came along with a whole lot more content, rights and privileges. They could open opportunities. A Grand Duke answered only to the Emperor, and as long as the Emperor approved, then he would be a sovereign ruler for his country. Ludwig used his new rank to remove a lot of the powers currently held by the nobility in Hesse-Darmstadt and create his new country in a pretty liberal mode for 19th century Germany. He had a council of ministers, and a prime minister, and a parliament, of which one house was actually elected by taxpayers. Ludwig stayed a loyal go-to guy for Napoleon right up until the Battle of Leipzig in 1813. But as soon as it was clear that the French wouldn't be back across the Rhine, Ludwig opened up the relationship and started seeing other countries. And he was firmly enmeshed with the Allied side by the time Waterloo rolled around. Which was very useful, and they do pretty well when Napoleon went out. Hesse Castle came back after Napoleon, but it was now the Electorate of Hesse, and smaller again. It and Hesse Darmstadt were now a similar size, and Hesse Darmstadt had been gaining more than territory in the intervening years. Still, if a German royal just referred to Hesse, then they probably meant the Electorate, due to seniority, sympathy for the occupation that they'd had, and the fact that Hesse Darmstadt were, to be frank, French-leaning Arabists. Ludwig and his state were new money, and they could be flash. Particularly the "and by Rhine" that Ludwig just had to add to the title in 1816 to apparently celebrate a moderately successful land swap. It is a hat on a hat, and it is a garish one. But you didn't move up the League of German Territories by being tasteful, self-effacing, and sensitive to criticism. And if you owed most of what you were to Napoleon, and you were living after Waterloo, then making sure that your title also included something that the Allies had given you was a very smart move. Teflon Ludwig I and his family, well, they were brash and they were a bit grasping. They were also adaptable, successful survivors who were putting in the work. Well, there was also a strain of political lumps in the family, and Ludwig's oldest son, also Ludwig, was one of them. His younger brother Emil was far brighter, and it was Emil, along with the Prime Minister, who would end up doing a lot of the day-to-day ruling for much of Ludwig II's reign. But original recipe Ludwig had managed to get his oldest son well married off in 1804, which in those days was a decent percentage of the job. His bride, Princess Wilhelmine of Baden, was vivacious and charming to Prince Ludwig's awkward and retiring. She was, for us, not just disturbingly, but criminally, 15 years old to son Ludwig's 26 when they got married. And Wilhelmine's connections were absolutely impeccable, which might well be why she got married off so young. In 1804, the future of their part of Germany was in the hands of Napoleon, and Hesse Darmstadt was well connected there. Ludwig had an heir that was already a bit overdue to procreate, and that was pretty much that. Ludwig and Wilhelmine were also first cousins, as were both sets of their parents. I mean, his parents were first cousins, her parents were first cousins, they were first cousins. They really played with the fire of cumulative inbreeding in that class and era. But still, check out the titles on her siblings. I mean, that's a winning hand. Particularly if your in-laws write the laws in the small country you're going to go and live in, and your marriage would turn out to be a rocky one. The rockiness of Wilhelmine and Ludwig's marriage is interesting because the rumours were, and are, if you read books on the subject or Rome Wikipedia, that the younger two surviving children that they had, Prince Alexander and Princess Marie, were not the children of Grand Duke Ludwig II at all, but the secret children of Baron August von Senner-Klenz de Grancy, Wilhelmine's personal travelling equerry, who was also hot, Swiss, and 6 years younger than she was. Scandaloso. Wilhelmine's son, Prince Alexander, was the ancestor of all the Mountbattens, and not that far back, Prince Alexander was Dickie Mountbatten's grandfather. This has been a quite polarised debate, and it's the sort of question that lends itself to picking a side. I find that the not de Grancy's kids camp tends to minimise the evidence that there is, and the they are de Grancy's kids camp tends to really overclaim on what they've got. Only my Goldilocks opinion is the right amount of considered. It will, however, involve quite a lot of painting the town beige, so I do need to spice something up, and it's going to be the visuals. And now everyone is so much better looking, we can begin. Alexander, Marie, and another sister, Elizabeth, who died in childhood, were born after a 12-year pregnancy gap for Ludwig and Wilhelmine. Ludwig was away at the wars for a decent chunk of that, and long pregnancy gaps were not uncommon in the period, although this is a particularly long one. The most likely time that de Grancy appeared is halfway through that pregnancy gap, when, according to the Hessian local history site, he was directly employed by Wilhelmine during a visit to Vevey in Switzerland in 1815. He became her personal travelling equerry, which can also be translated as travelling stable master in that period. These days an equerry or equerry is basically an official personal assistant to a royal supplied by the armed forces. The job has a degree of close personal contact, and in the modern era, marriages and potential marriages between royals and equerries are not unknown. In those days, at a royal level, well, I don't think de Grancy was picking any horse's feet out of a morning, but there would have been a lot more horse admin to the equerry job. But travelling equerry did mean he would always be close to her side and potentially available, and that was going to get noticed and gossiped about as time went on. The starting gun for all this speculation was an actual documented separation for the couple, which started in 1827 after all the kids had been born. The youngest at the time was 3, and Wilhelmine was 39 by then. The marriage would have been under serious stress anyway, because their daughter Elizabeth had died in 1826. And in that period, Wilhelmine acquired a new property of her own, which she would move into with the 2 youngest children. That property was a reasonably substantial country estate called Heilegenberg, after the mountain that it sat on near Jugendheim, and it had been previously owned by the country's finance minister. It would one day become the Mountbattens' ancestral German summer home. Germany really does castles, and it would pay you not to mistake the Mountbattens' castle Heilegenberg for the other far more famous castle Heilegenberg, which is vast, in the south of the country near Switzerland, and looks like the home of a Disney character. The Mountbattens' castle Heilegenberg was the small white one in the mountains. In English, it often gets called a castle, but it's more of a schloss than a burg. It's a bit big for a manor house, a bit small for a palace, and not fortified enough to be a castle. It has Berg in its name because of the mountain that it sits on, not because it's fortified. It might be hard to describe, but it looks like what it was, which was a holiday palace for an imperial family. The sort of place an actual emperor would look at and go, "Oh, how quaint and cosy, like a cottage, let's spend a month." It was less grand than it is now when Wilhelmine bought it. She and her son Alexander would both spend time and money upgrading and refurbishing until it was fit to become an imperial holiday palace for Marie and her new family. Heilegenberg wasn't the first property that Wilhelmine had owned and developed. In Darmstadt, she built a small house in a very large garden called Rosenhöhe, which she often used as a city retreat when she was in the capital. She had their daughter Elizabeth buried there, and from then on the gardens also contained the family mausoleum. Wilhelmine and Ludwig managed a public reconciliation a couple of years later, in 1829, in time for their also public silver wedding celebrations. How deep that reconciliation went is not known. Might have been genuine, might have been more of an arrangement, then or later. In 1830, original recipe Ludwig died, and the second Ludwig became Ludwig II, and public appearances with him and Wilhelmine as a couple became more of a thing. But whatever kind of reconciliation the couple had, their two youngest kids were not invited to it. They continued to live out in the country at Heilegenberg, cared for mainly by their tutors. Mum stopped being around because she was increasingly ill. We know she was seriously ill by 1835, so she probably wasn't doing great a few years before that. And Dad appears to have just not been around those kids much. It was when Alexander and Marie were young that Ludwig became the Grand Duke, which meant he now controlled all of the ducal palaces and properties. Yet his two youngest kids grew up in seclusion on Mum's brand new country estate. The tuberculosis was winning against Wilhelmine, and she died in 1836, aged 48, when Alexander and Marie were just 13 and 11 years old. And certainly from that point, they would have been increasingly affected by the rumours that were going around about them. These were rumours that they were not Ludwig's children, often with an implied August de Grancy, who had remained a key part of their mother's household and who still held an official position in Ludwig's. Whether the rumours were true or not, that speculation was part of their life experience, and for the kids, a very difficult one. The rumours really have to have got going locally by 1836, because in 1839, Marie got unexpectedly and unofficially engaged to the most eligible bachelor in the whole of Europe, the Tsarevich of the Russian Empire. And that kind of broke this whole thing wide open. Those rumours got fired at her potential in-laws at least twice within weeks of her unofficial engagement, and then again later as the months went on from multiple international sources. So, yeah, those rumours were around. And someone made sure to tell her unofficial fiancé about them during his visit, which only lasted a day or two, or very shortly afterwards, like within the week. And we know this because the Tsarevich wrote to his father shortly after the visit. The Tsar discussed it with the Austrian ambassador, who then wrote and told Prince Metternich about it, and the information got stashed in a letter that got put in the Austrian archives. In that letter, Fichelmont reported that the Tsarevich had noticed that Marie was being treated very poorly in her father's court. And surely Ludwig's court would get its cues on how to treat Ludwig's daughter from Ludwig. This treatment was also linked in the letter to the rumours about her paternity. Wilhelmine's will favoured all her younger children. She left Rosenhöhe, her property in Darmstadt, to second son Karl. The larger bequest was Heilegenberg, which she left to Alexander and Marie equally, which is how the Mountbattens ended up inheriting it through Alexander. And with that action, Wilhelmine did give Alexander and Marie long-term security, and also for de Grancy, who continued his employment and lived in his home at the foot of the mountain until his death, long after Wilhelmine and Ludwig, in 1871. There would be a lot of connections between the de Grancys and the ruling family over the next few decades, like de Grancy's sister becoming Marie's governess and travelling to Russia with her. But this was mostly to be expected. In this era, getting your capable relatives jobs is what you did if you worked for royalty. Slightly harder to explain would be his sister's significantly generous pension when her work was done, and the way he managed to call all three of his daughters some version of Wilhelmine and Marie. There is a bit of historiographical controversy. These are the 4 sets of documents that were most likely to hold details or clues about Alexander and Marie's paternity and their childhood. Whether or not these documents were absolutely all destroyed in the firebombing of World War II, or whether there are, for example, selected copies of some pages of the tutor's diary available, has tended to depend on how sympathetic the author is to the Mountbatten family's version of events. E.H. Cookridge got to see those selected copies of pages, but whenever Anthony Lambton asked for whatever was available, he got told that the archives were closed because they were being reorganised. Frankly, Dicky, as we're going to see, used up all the pure benefit of the doubt the family was due about 3 pages into the book he consulted on, and I don't think the family's been fully embracing getting into credit since he died. These documents certainly don't appear in the Mountbatten archive at Southampton University, which does have quite a lot of Alexander's documents in it. There is later evidence, and some of it's pretty good, but I haven't included it because it comes up so much later that it more speaks to the rumours and the social effect of all of this, rather than whether or not de Grancy was actually biologically their dad. Last piece of evidence before judgment is resemblance. So let us, regretfully, take off the historical drama filter and remember that it's not everything. Resemblance can often steer you wrong. Oh God, how can we look at them? We must. History demands. There's something there, isn't there? And one of those things looks like a family nose. It's not everything, but it's worth a few % for me. The Not de Grancy's Kids Camp does like to talk about rumour and how little evidence there really is, and if it's not certain, what even is the point? I say that for a possible non-paternity event from 200 years ago, for which DNA evidence is not available, this is rocking a pretty strong circumstantial case. For me, with all this circumstantial evidence, I think it's about a 60-40 chance that they were de Grancy's kids. I don't think that percentage is going to get any higher for me without a German historical revelation or some DNA evidence. And given the amount of cousin marriage before and since, testing for that would be difficult. Your mileage may vary, of course, and if you have a different opinion, drop it in the comments. If you'd like to see the full fat version of this episode with details of all the evidence rather than just me telling you about it, then that version is available on the channel homepage. Feels good to get out of the first Mountbatten historical controversy with what feels like a still reasonable opinion. Next time we're going to look at how an obscure German princess with paternity issues managed to score the greatest dynastic match in Europe. Marie might not have been a direct ancestor of the Mountbattens, but she was a family member, and her marriage and their relationship to the Russian imperial family was going to be a quantum leap in the family fortunes.